I forgot about that. Like, he sort of just.
You weren't having a good time.
And so I can see this look in my eyes when I look at my stuff.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for your patience, and we're terribly sorry for the delay. This is our final event, or second to last event of the year, and naturally, this is the day when YouTube's compatibility started to become an enormous issue. So we have managed to reset and start a new stream. So thank you to all of you joining us on YouTube right now, and for your patience also. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to point out that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at the store. Somewhat sweaty, just a tiny bit beleaguered, and so very grateful that you were all able to just make community in this space. Thank you very much. I am genuinely very excited about what we have coming up tonight, though. We have a wonderful lineup of incredible readers. Kit Dobson and Tanis MacDonald are here for the Winnipeg launch of their Woolsack and Wind books, Field Notes on Listening, and Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. And, you may applaud that. And we're joined by a very special guest, Aubrey Jean Hansen, who will be reading from her own book, Literatures, Communities, and Learning, Conversations with Indigenous Writers, which is published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. I am the least interesting person you'll be hearing from, so I will keep my notes brief. Just a few quick things. While we're in this space, we just ask that you all remain masked. You'll notice that those of us who wander behind a microphone will temporarily unmask to speak and then put it back on afterward. Once we move outside for the actual signing portion of the evening, masks will not be required, but we do recommend them. There are copies of all of tonight's books just at the signing table, so please do feel free to avail yourself of one when you approach the table to get a book signed afterward. Just please do remember to visit the cash desk on your way out of the store. And I will point out that we have lots of copies there, and we will just ask you all to remain seated for one moment at the close of the event while we transport all of tonight's authors over there, where they can meet you, chat, and sign copies of their wonderful books. But that is more than enough for me right now. Instead, I'd just like to invite up your host for this evening. I have a biography, which I was told not to read, but I can say that Ariel Gordon is an acclaimed Winnipeg writer whose tolerance we occasionally, or whose presence we occasionally tolerate in the store. She is the author of Treed, Walking in Canada's Urban Forests, and Tree Talk, which was a public poetry project that manifested as a book from Matt Bay Press. They are both wonderful. She is acceptable, but glorious in many, many ways, and I'm so very pleased to be able to introduce her this evening. Please join me in welcoming the truly inimitable Ariel Gordon.
So we have been on a bit of a tour, and we all drove in today from Regina. And so and we got here and there was confusion and the downtown traffic was terrible. Everything was backed up. It was like a downtown of honking. And so, I haven't changed from the road. I'm all rumpled and disheveled and crabby. And so I asked, when I got here, I asked John if he wanted to leg wrestle so I could work out some of my angst, and he said no. And then he proceeds to provoke me again. So I think there's definitely, if you want to stay at the end after the signing, there will be some leg wrestling. Or I'll just be kicking him to death, one or the other. All right. And this is not in the least like the Wizard of Oz with the man behind the curtain. Don't look behind the curtain. There's nothing of interest there. Yes, I'm so glad to be here. We have been having a mini tour through the prairies, and it's so good to be back in Manitoba, to be in this bookstore. Aubrey is like, do I have to go into the event? Can't I just walk around and look at all the books? I was like, afterwards, do that afterwards, Aubrey. But we have some amazing books. I've gotten to see Kit and Tanis's books come into being from when they were just ideas being discussed and planned and then actually written. And Woolsack and Wind, who was my publisher as well, is such a great place to publish nature-y nonfiction. and books about ideas and poetry. And so they're from Hamilton, and I have really loved working with them. And I think for Tanis and Heath, this is both a repeat performance. So either they're a glutton for punishment, or they also really like Woolsack and Win. And Aubrey had her first ever reading from this book last night in Regina. So this is her second only reading from this book. And that's what happened to many of us who had books out in 2020 and 2021, not being able to do in-person events. So I think Aubrey, who I'm going to introduce right now, imminently, deserves the biggest round of applause, because you are her second audience, in-person audience. And you know, that's a lot of pressure on you to be appreciative, but I feel like you can do it. All right. All right, so Aubrey Jean Hansen is a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta and an associate professor at the University of Calgary's Worklund School of Education. Her ancestry extends to Métis, German, Icelandic, French, and Scottish roots. Please join me in welcoming an extra loud, extra special Winnipeg welcome to Aubrey Jean Hansen.
Wow. Thanks, Winnipeg. Thanks, Ariel. True fact, you get to see people in 3D, you see how short they are. Thanks for labeling our waters. It's so nice. Well, it is super exciting to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join this launch. Belatedly, there is an online book launch that happened, but it's so different to get to be here with folks. So thank you so much for coming. I want to begin. I feel like it's a big deal to be speaking on Indigenous Peoples Day, and it's just, I'm so proud to be here. And as soon as I open my mouth, whatever I say better be good. And one of the things that I love best about this book, my first book, is it's actually really not about me. This is something that I'm sharing back out of a project that I got to do, and I feel really good about that, but I'll say more about that in a minute. I want to just begin with thanks. Thanks again for welcoming me into your event, you two, and Ariel for the gracious hosting, to Woolsack and Win for all the things that have been done to organize, to McNally Robinson. This space is so beautiful, and I just, as Ariel said, was super distracted coming in. Once a nerd, always a nerd. I want to thank, I'm proud. I want to thank Wilfrid Laurier for the experience of publishing this text, because it was just such a beautiful caretaking experience. I had a wonderful experience working with them. I was a really nervous first bookmaker person. What are those called? Authors. Right. I didn't know what I was doing, and they just really shepherded me through it in such a beautiful relational way, and really took care of this and brought it to being. So I appreciate that. And thank you folks for being here and making this different from just talking into a box like that online experience. So again, reflecting on, oh, and thank you also for the land acknowledgement, because it just makes me feel like, okay, we're ready to begin. And I think on this day, I'm always reminded about what it means to be called into relationship with all of our relatives on the land and here in the human world, and all of our interconnections. I think that I really want the spirit of this work to come across, which is, it is about those relationships. And I've selected passages today that I think kind of call that into the room and give us a little bit of something to share about that on this important day. I think a lot about what I call starting with story. I was a high school teacher before I moved into the university, and I've thought a lot about what the project of teaching and learning after the TRC and in this day and age involves, the complexity of building better relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and engaging in decolonial enterprises. And to me, it's like story is the best place to start, because it calls you in, you're in relationship, and when you're in relationship, you're responsible to each other, and then we kind of can take it from there. So that's kind of what I've chosen to highlight from the book today. Very briefly, because I don't want to take up too much time explaining the project. This is a book of interviews with Indigenous writers who I simply ask them to speak about why their work matters, why it matters to communities, why it matters to, you know, the learning of, many of them are also teachers, so the learning of their students and to broader society as well. So I'll leave it there. I hope you, with my intro, I mean, don't worry, I'm gonna read some. And I hope you have the chance to hear about it. There's also, speaking of hearing about it, there is also an audiobook for this too, if folks are interested in that way of engaging with work. So I'm gonna start with a piece that also it provides a little bit more context about the kind of work I was doing. This is from Cherokee writer Daniel Heath Justice, who is also an educator, but many people don't realize he wrote this fantastic fantasy trilogy that is like, you must check it out. So I'm just going to jump in because this little section actually explains what we're talking about, but it's midway through the interview. So I'm going to do a little bit like, and then I says, and then he says, because we're joint voices. So I says to Daniel, I want to bring you into dialogue a bit with the teachers I talked to. Generally, the teachers I've spoken with are non-Indigenous English teachers or social studies teachers or Aboriginal studies teachers. They're working in high schools or maybe with younger kids, but the context I usually talk about is secondary education. All of them are in Calgary, and we're talking about how they take up Indigenous content, whether literatures and English classes or different kinds of things in social or Aboriginal studies. I asked them, and that's what our course was called at the time, how do you, as a non-Indigenous teacher, given this task, how do you position yourself in taking up that teaching work? Whether it's from the curriculum, from your own school, from your own sense of ethics, or all of the above, like wherever you're doing it. Do you feel comfortable doing it? We talk about resources, we talk about supports, we talk about a lot of things. So kind of giving him context about the other conversations I was having at the same time with educators. I want to share with you 2 examples of what these teachers said. One says that she has a lot of connections with people, and she knows that if she makes a mistake in the teaching that she does, somebody will tell her and will guide her. She's in connection with lots of supports. That's one example. I had another teacher who said she is intimidated to do this kind of work. She articulated very thoughtful ideas about the teaching she does do with Indigenous texts. And one of the things that struck me is she said it's intimidating work. She's afraid of getting things wrong. She said the reason it's intimidating is because it matters. She knows enough to know it's important. She's afraid of getting it wrong. Looking at these 2 teachers and all the spaces in between them, what would you say to non-Indigenous teachers who are struggling with that question? They know teaching Indigenous lit to high school kids is the right thing to do. What would you tell them about that struggle, about how to do it well? So Daniel says, he says now, the first one is, yeah, you're going to screw up. You're totally going to screw up, just like Indigenous teachers screw up. That's the nature of the beast, the reality of teaching. We're going to mess it up. And what's going to work for one group of students is not going to work for the next one. Part of it is to own your imperfection. No one expects that they're going to get it right on other stuff all the time. In some ways, that fear of it being perfect can work to lull teachers into a sense that the fear is the work, but the fear isn't the work. The fear can keep you from doing the work. And by the way, I'm reading this because I think this is a really prevalent sentiment among folks who are reading, who are teaching Indigenous literature, is engaging with them, trying to build their knowledge and connect with Indigenous communities. This is something I hear a lot in the work and teaching that I do. And these interviews, by the way, were done in 2015 when the landscape was pretty different. So things were just shifting. A lot of the teachers I was talking to were not yet mandated to teach Indigenous literatures. They were doing it actually kind of resisting. It was really uphill work. So Daniel says to the teachers, you're going to screw up, but you're probably not going to destroy your students. If you say Indian instead of First Nations, the student might get irritated at you. You're probably not going to destroy their entire lives. So I think it's also about keeping things in perspective. This is important work, but it's important in the big picture. You might screw things up one day, own it, come back, apologize, fix it if you can. I tell students I work with when they're teaching, yeah, you may mess up, but there's a huge difference between messing up honestly, being a thoughtful, nice person, and doing something that destroys a student's sense of self. There's a whole world of difference between pronouncing names wrong once or twice and after being corrected, either repeatedly getting them wrong or outright mocking their names. One error is a mistake, multiple errors is a pattern. There's a whole world of difference between focusing too much on violence in the work by an Indigenous writer and normalizing that violence as though that's the only thing about Indigenous people. You're going to screw it up and you're going to get it right. You can't learn to get it right if you don't risk screwing it up. You learn, you work, you do better, and you cut yourself a break, you cut your students a break. If you go in with the expectation of perfection, you've already failed. So I really appreciate that from Daniel, because that is something that I think a lot of folks need to hear, and learners, like whenever I'm learning something new, I really do. I think like, oh, I should know everything before I even go there. I should know everything and get it right as soon as I start to talk. But I know as a teacher, I've been thrown into a lot of situations where like I have no idea what I'm doing and I have to learn alongside my students. And so just having that intellectual humility has saved me from a lot of awkward scenarios. Okay, I want to read a tiny bit as well from Métis poet Marilyn Dumont's interview. I love Marilyn. Her writing has meant so much to me, and I love her as a fierce, like, anti-mentor, not anti-mentor, but like anti, like she's an anti-mentor. You can quote me on that. Anti and a mentor. And her writing for me certainly, like, as one of the ways in which I encountered Métis writing as a young person who was trying to figure out how to engage with community and learn about Métis peoples and histories and presences, and her work has meant a lot to me. So I was so nervous before I interviewed her. I was like shaking, but she set me at ease, and we had a really great conversation. So one of the questions, I came around to asking her, is it safe to say you didn't see yourself reflected in what you learned at school or what you were given to read? And she says, nothing, no. In fact, the general feeling I went away from school with was that I was deficient. I needed to be something different. I needed to be white or more white. I always felt like there was something wrong, something just not quite good enough. I had to fight against that, and I did it through my writing. Really, it was to write myself back into visibility. I don't think people realize how damaging that whole colonial legacy is. When you feel like a zero and a nothing, or not important, not interesting. You have no knowledge, you come from a culture that is not important. That hurt me. It really hurt, because when I looked at my parents, I thought, they know a lot of stuff. Growing up in the bush, my dad could easily make camp for us. He'd go out with his little hatchet or saw and cut things down, set up a camp perfectly so it wouldn't blow down in the wind. My mom was the same. She could cook over an open fire. She could bring out that frying pan and make bannock right there. It seemed to me like that stuff other people don't know how to do. It was something that they possessed as knowledge. And both of them, speaking Cree, that was always seen as backward or not important, like that's of no use whatsoever, and what good is that kind of thing. That was really painful for me, to have people think that my parents were like blank slates, that they had no knowledge. It was ridiculous. These kind of ideas were perpetuated in the school system. These kind of things hurt me to the core. And then I had to get them out and write about it. Thank goodness she did. So, and she goes on to say quite a bit more about how Indigenous literatures are a way of people, of giving people that access to learning and connecting and countering the disconnection between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities that I just really admire her way of thinking it through. So just to wrap up, I'll just read a paragraph. I don't like to read the sections that I wrote, but I think actually today, I think this little bit from the conclusion kind of speaks to why I did the project and what I hope people will take away. So this is me talking, just to be clear. I really like to credit people's words. As Indigenous communities continue to work for and enact self-determination, and as a hopefully growing number of Canadians work to unsettle what they know, to confront colonialism, and to co-conspire toward decolonial transformation, the arts can foster learning and inspire the ensuing labor of implementing change. The artistry of Indigenous literatures, the compelling voices that speak through them, the human connections that they depict and catalyze, and the truths, dreams, histories, alternatives, and visions that they convey can lure readers into learning and into deepening their relationships with Indigenous communities. This draw can materialize regardless of whether the community is one's own or separated from one's own by vast differences, geographies, or emotional barriers. And as so many writers in this collection have suggested, literatures can be a way in to learning, to relationships, and to transformation. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Aubrey. That was really lovely and inspiring. All right, so next, we have Kit Dawgson, and I always like to do show and tell. And I'm doing my very best Vanna White, so if you could respond, then, ooh, And for the poets in the room, I think some of you already know, but this begins and ends with poetry, which is really how all nonfiction should be framed. And I'm gonna let Kit tell you more about this book, but I am going to tell you who he is. And then after that, we'll have Tanis, and then we'll have the signing and the discussion. It will be lovely. All right. Kit Dobson lives and works in Calgary/Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta. His previous books include Mauled, Deciphering Shopping in Canada, and he is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Calgary. He grew up in many places across Canada, but returned again and again to the landscapes of northern Alberta, where his family members settled and that continue to animate his thinking. Please welcome Kit Dobson.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to jump right in, lead with some poetry, and then talk a bit about what this book is about, and read a couple other passages. So, the sound of snowmobiles blasting across the frozen surface of Sylvan Lake, Alberta on New Year's Day. The sound of fires raging across New South Wales, Australia, as streamed on the internet. The sound of drone strikes reported on the news. The sound of snow falling on blue and white spruces outside the window. The sound of surface to surface and surface to air missiles. The sound of a 2-stroke gas-powered leaf blower, which my neighbor uses to clear snow from his paths. The sound of snow crunching underfoot. The sound of 1 billion animals burnt to death. The sound of 3 white-tailed deer walking down the path to the writing studio. The sound of Donald Trump. The sound of heavy ornamentation and Baroque music. The sound of an ermine darting in and out of a snowbank. The sound of Brexit. The sound of the ice in my eyelashes hitting the ice on my balaclava when I blink. The sound of grief. The sound of wine, conversation, a piano, artists sharing their work on a cold winter's night. The sound of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. The sound of coronavirus. The sound of the dog's claws on the melted and refrozen snow. The sound of pages turning in an old copy of Jacob's Room. The sound of the CBC. The sound of rain in February. The sound of wind picking through dried fescues and sweetgrass in a Chinook-cleared grassland. The sound of suffering. The sound of chickadees in Chinook weather. The sound of jet engines. The sound of public transit. The sound of solidarity blockades on rail lines. The sound of crowds in the Puerta del Sol, Madrid. The sound of Twitter. The sound of shoes. The sound of a lizard scuttling across the warm bricks on the pathway in the garden at noon. The sound of cars, cars, cars. The sound of budget cuts. The sound of parrots. The sound of leap day. The sound of quarantines. The sound of stock market rallies and crashes. The sound of the different regional accents of Spain. The sound of wine being poured. The sound of horns honking and feet moving. The sound of voices through thin walls. The sound of the state of exception. The sound of birds in the warm Madrid morning as the lockdown begins. The sound of anxious travelers. The sound of airplanes. The sound of relief upon landing in Calgary. The sound of -20 weather. The sound of snowplows. The sound of the people of Italy singing from their balconies. So this book, and as that opening already suggests, invokes sound and invokes listening. This is a book in which I endeavor to think about the landscapes of northern Alberta, which is the landscapes on which my family settled at various different times, largely in the first half of the 20th century. And specifically, these are lands around in northern Alberta, about an hour and a half north of Edmonton, in and around the town of Athabasca, for anyone who might know Athabasca. It's a book that I'm tremendously glad to have been able to write. I'm very grateful to, as Tanis mentioned, this is a book that Woolsey been supported from when it was an idea and hadn't yet been realized in any form. So I'm terribly grateful to Noelle and at Woolsey and Win for putting her trust in this project early on. I'm very grateful to Ariel Gordon for I think herding us across the prairies, helping us to make this tour possible. Wonderful to be here with Tanis MacDonald. Aubrey, thank you for your reading. Thank you to McMillan Robinson. Thank you to John behind the curtain for managing things. I'm very grateful, of course, to everyone who has taken their time today to be here as well. So this is a book that, it thinks about that landscape in Northern Alberta, and it thinks it back through family story, and it thinks about what it means to return to a landscape and to dwell in it, to think about it for a long period of time. It's a landscape that is important to note for me that I've never formally lived on, but that I've spent a tremendous amount of time on returning to it at intervals and gaps. And those intervals and gaps have always taught me new things. And so I'm now continuing to learn and really continuing to learn as I wrote this project and then continue to learn well beyond its writing as well. I want to read another short passage that I also think of as a poetic passage that leads into a slightly longer passage I'm going to read about my grandfather, who was actually born in Brandon, Manitoba, so of course not far from here. We drove through Brandon earlier today. Things that I've inherited: my grandfather's belt buckle. I realize I should have it on me today, but I don't. The daily used farm dishes, or at least the ones that hadn't been broken. The family silver, my granny's day planner, a nagging feeling of doubt. The dining room tables from both family farms, the family piano, a love of country music. The chairs for the dining room tables from both family farms. The fear that a good year portends a worse year to come. The knowledge of which plants are good to eat. A love of gardening, baking, and canning. A blue trunk with brass trim. Copies of Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments, Fear and Trembling, and the Sickness unto Death. A copy of my granny's master's thesis. The need to be outdoors. A persistent worry about brain tumors. A pair of old snowshoes. 3 framed prints that used to hang in the farmhouse. Several pieces of Cree art from Northern Alberta. About 20 farmer hats from farm supply and explosive companies, which I should also be wearing one of today. A love of open skies and wide horizons. A thirst to visit other places. My grandfather's Stetson. Sadly, the Stetson actually doesn't fit me. I wish it did. It's going to be a short passage, which is about my grandfather, which is designed to sort of give a sense, from across the book of some of the different pieces. And then I'm going to return. I'll close briefly with similar to where I open. I open and close with the sounds. These are sounds that I was recording when I was in the process of writing most of this book. It was mostly written between January and June of 2020. I don't know if y'all can remember January to June of 2020. Weird that there's part of me that actually can't quite remember that time. And so when I go back to these sounds, I find them in some ways sort of haunting or sort of a little bit uncanny now, because there's so much from that time that happened, and it happened in rapid succession. All of our lives changed, of course. And then the parts when I go back and revisit it that I realize I've forgotten very quickly. I think my brain is still handling or unpacking the trauma of that time. I think it's an experience that I share with many. First, passage about my grandfather, about Northern Alberta. My grandfather, as I knew him, was rough and melancholy, yet he was at times a warm man. He was short on words in most of our interactions. He was also quite deaf and only got hearing aids late in life. But his silence was much more than that. It was, I believe, silence born of a personal suffering that I could not understand. He was a farmer, beset by the woes and anxieties that farmers have faced for a long time in Canada. In later years, the farm began a transition toward becoming one of the first organic farms in Northern Alberta. As far as I know, it never got there, but my grandparents tried. My grandfather also worked in oil and gas exploration as part of a seismic crew. He spent winters in the far north when the farm was under a thick coat of ice and snow. In the far north, he lived in camps, performing tests to seek oil and gas formations deep underground. My grandfather was a tough man, a man who once killed a polar bear with a bow and arrow. A man who, another time, saved another worker from a polar bear mauling. A man who, in yet another tale, once kicked a polar bear through a doorway as it tried to get into the kitchen in the crew's trailer. All of these stories, though, were ones that I heard secondhand, not from him. His sons told the stories, while he preferred to work in the garage. Finally, my grandfather was an alcoholic, although he was sober by the time that I knew him. AA turned his life around. He was devoted to the meetings and the roundups, the gatherings of the AA community. It gave him his social net in his later years. Before that, he nearly lost it all to his addiction. But that part of his story comes before my experience of him. While the family was always very open about his being in AA, what brought him there is much less mine to share. Some stories are perhaps best honored by being held in the past. We could have a lengthy debate about that proposition, however, one in which I would most likely disagree with myself. The lost digits and limbs of lives spent working in harsh conditions show up in so many of the stories. I returned to my grandfather's tales. I learned to play cribbage and to drive a tractor from him, though I don't recall spending too much time at his knee. But I learned much more along the way. My memories are of cigarette smoke, of his riding the tractor across the farmyard, or of his tools, the garage in which he was forever fixing broken pieces of machinery. Plaid mackinaws, snowy work boots, the sound and smell of his pickup trucks. As a farmer, he worked long hours, spring to fall, in an effort to make a go of farming in a difficult environment. But in the winter slowdowns, he went north. So, in the winters, Granny and her 5 sons oversaw the farm. They managed as best they could. In the north, my grandfather worked for the same company for over 30 years. He was involved in setting, detonating, and measuring seismic charges. Grandpa and the crew would be left in a trailer with supplies and would blow up things underground, listening for the reverberations. The photos that survive from that time show some rough and tumble men from many places. They enacted their manhood in an environment of snow and ice, snowmobiles, and diesel generators. No way in or out, but by air or by the ice roads. People got bushed. Stories from the far north also feature lost digits and frozen bodies. As his sons told the stories, Grandpa would sometimes be there to grunt or to interject a correction. Perhaps a correction to the story of the man who, out walking in the northern bush in the winter, tripped and managed to sever his own nose by landing on his machete. In Grandpa's stories, I heard the sound of long winter nights, the cold and natural threats out of doors. There was laughter at near misses that had been survived. I imagined the noise of bears snuffling. I listened for the details. The stories where my grandfather could, for a brief spell, play the role of hero were the ones that I thought best, especially against bears. The bear that wouldn't leave the camp's garbage bin, the bear that my grandfather dispatched, was a good story, for example. I found most striking the story of the time that Grandpa and the crew woke to discover that one of their bunch was missing. The man had gone out in the night to relieve himself. They found him mauled and nearly frozen, not far from the trailer. Yet the bear had left him alive. From the story, my grandfather helped to bring him in and then got under the blankets with the man, slowly warming him back to life, as one must do for victims of hypothermia. I did not know the outcome beyond the fact that the man lived. I imagined that he was airlifted out by bushman. It would serve the story well if the man lost his toes or his fingers, but those details were never part of the narrative that I heard. What impressed itself upon me, and from my young age, was the cost of labor. The work that asked for small pieces of bodies left in fragments by the elements, by the cold costs of just living. There's an unsorted box of photographs from that time, the 1960s and 70s, in my parents' house. Photography then took much more effort and care. So I take note of what appears in the pictures. Farms, farm animals, cows, horses, and dogs mostly, in family gatherings, smiling collections of my forebears and their neighbors. In one memorable shot, a woman, and no one can remember who she was standing on 2 moving horses, one foot in a stirrup of each, smiling at the camera. It's a great picture. Then there are pictures of the far north. These photos show that my grandfather took a camera with him on at least some of the trips. There are photographs of vast expanses of ice and snow, sunny, cold, brittle environments that I cannot place. I anticipate that he spent at least some time near Cape Dorset, as he brought home lithographs by Inuit artists from that region, as well as carvings. 2 lithographs by the artist Pudlow hang in my parents' home today. There are photos of the trailers in which the camp men stayed. Some interior shots show men at rest. There are some shots of my young grandfather at about the same age that I am now, looking less beaten and worn down by the world by the weight of irresolvable finances, lost cows, failed crops, and drink. There are photos of the machinery that they were using, snowcats and snowmobiles, plows, drills, and things that I cannot identify. I've understood little of Grandpa's life up north. I've seen it as one of the gaps between us. Yet the seismic work that my grandfather was part of, I realized through conversations with others, was also a form of listening to the land. The data that the early crews were generating involved laying a field of instruments linked to a blasting cap. When the detonation went off, equipment recorded the vibrations and used these in order to show the different densities of what lay below. Doing so allowed the teams to map the subterranean, because oil, gas, rock, and ice deposits have different densities. They send back different vibrational responses to the blasts. The same crews came back winter after winter, and the experienced teams became proficient at laying charges well and generating solid data. I found myself thinking of Michael Ondaatje's novel The Skin of a Lion, which I know some people here know as well. I recalled that the father at the beginning of that book is a dynamiter hired by logging companies to clear jams along waterways. Expertise in blowing stuff up is valuable. Knowing how to listen to the land, to ice, to trees, and then knowing how to move them efficiently is the thing that is valued. And those on the land are the ones doing the work of listening too, even while that very act of listening may be in the service of labor that may harm the land. It is perhaps a paradox. Those who live closest to the land, whose livelihoods are linked to altering and perhaps even injuring it, also often have the best understanding of it, how to care for and steward it, if only they are given the chance. When people who live in rural environments express distaste for urban environmentalists, who have little experience with or connection to the land, I find myself more and more understanding their displeasure. The photographs of the north are cold, desolate. The colors are accentuated by the old Kodachrome film stock. I imagine the frozen earth under my smoky grandfather's feet rumbling. The equipment listens to the vibrations. Another day's work is complete. There are photos taken of happy faces inside the trailer. Men lounge in their long johns and flannel shirts. Cards lie on the table. Cigarettes are being smoked down to their filters. It's a very limited supply. Dynamiters, technical crews, engineers, cooks, cleaners. The equipment is out there freezing. The nights are long and cold. The stars grind overhead and the music of the northern lights shimmers. I try to imagine the numbing cold day after day and the repetition of those days and nights on the land. As someone who seldom deals with quite so flat a geography nor quite such an expanse of time, the prospect is both thrilling and terrifying. I think of how humans listen to one another, listen to the land, endeavoring to negotiate our complex relationships with one another as they look over these old photographs of the icy distances. I'm going to wrap briefly, like I said, by returning to sound. As I do so, I want to say another brief thing that I've brought along on my travels. I have one of these left, and it's a giveaway for whoever comes in and asks for it first when we're done. These are just little poetry leaflets that were done by Kyle Flummer, who is himself a poet, writer, and runs a micropress called The Blasted Tree. It's based in Calgary. And these are the 100 sounds that I've started with and that I'm going to end with, done up as a separate little leaflet. I think they're quite lovely, and I'm very thankful to Kyle, to The Blasted Tree, for putting these out. So please, I hope that somebody will come and claim this. The sound of birds, not traffic, from the balcony. The sound of physical distancing. The sound of stimulus packages and bailouts. The sound of ventilator shortages. The sound of self-isolation. The sound of spring. The sound of my slow, steady pulse. The sound of online video conferencing. Thank you to everyone on YouTube for joining us. The sound of dance parties in the kitchen. The sound of daily updates from the Prime Minister. The sound of the news. The sound of the children home from school. The sound of walking the dog. The sound of hand sanitizer. The sound of everything being canceled. The sound of K-pop. The sound of school from home. The sound of keys jangling, the sound of the first robins of spring, the sound of the laundry machine walking across the floor during the spin cycle, the endless, endless sound of Donald Trump, the sound of songbirds, the sound of the dog asking to be taken out for another walk, the sound of onions and garlic sauteing in the pan, the sound of spring rains, the sound of memes, the sound of the same day stuck on repeat, the sound of trees in bloom, the sound of snow piles melting and rivulating down toward the storm drains, the sound of medical professionals conducting press conferences, the sound of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, the sound of springtime thunderstorms, the sound of the United States unraveling, the sound of Black Lives Matter, the sound of tentative reopening, the sound of sunshine, the sound of gardens, the sound of curfews, the sound of protest, rage, and hurt, the sound of fish jumping in the evening light, the sound of a grouse defending her nest, the sound of fireweed shoots, the sound of a black bear up ahead on the trail, the sound of keys clacking on keyboards, the sound of a dog and coyote call and answer on solstice, solstice being today, 2 years ago. The sound of all of the cats pissed off because the humans are all still home. The sound of a caress, a sigh, the sound of stockpiling, the sound of spruces creaking, the sound of bated breath. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One of the pleasures of launching here at McNally's is that if you do an event, there's water set out for you and your name is written by which water is your water. So Kit, I know, is drinking from his water and hasn't stolen my water, which is a very important distinction. All right, there's, you know, if you go to Halifax to live, you'll be a come from away. Unless you've been there for 30 years. But the saying goes, if you come to Winnipeg and stay for 3 weeks, you're considered a Winnipegger until the end of time. Now, Tanis has lived in Kitchener-Waterloo for many years now, but she was born here and she was raised here and she always comes back to launch her books. And I know she considers this a home of sorts, a once and forever home. I like to say that former Winnipeggers are once and forever Winnipeggers. And she is the best colleague in the world, and I'm so glad that I get to do all this stuff alongside her. And now I'm going to read her official bio and stop saying nice things. Stupid nice things. Tanis MacDonald is an essayist, poet, professor, and free-range literary animal. She's the host of the podcast Watershed Writers and the author of Out of Line, Daring to be an Artist Outside the Big City. Her essay, Monda Green Girls, won the Malahat Review's Open Seasons Award for Creative Nonfiction in 2021. She identifies as a bad birder and lives near Osakewanee in southwestern Ontario as a grateful guest on traditional Haudenosaunee territory. Please welcome Tanis MacDonald.
Thanks, everyone. We're going to lower this after Ariel spoke. Thanks everyone for coming tonight, and thank you everyone who's joining us on YouTube. Thank you, John. Yeah, this is my old hood. This is actually my teenage mall. Right, ways to come and like cruise the stores, and there was no McNally Robinson at the time because I think if there had been a McNally Robinson that was mall at the time, I probably just would have slept, among the books and never left. When you're reading the old hometown, you have to read something about the hometown. So I thought I'd give you a little piece of an essay that takes place in Winnipeg. I'll explain the book just slightly before I do that. It's called Straggle, Adventures in Walking Wild Female. And I wrote it because I was interested in the kind of politics of walking and the kind of paradox of being told to walk for your health We heard a lot of that during the pandemic, but even before that, walk for your health, walk for your mental and physical health. But if you occupy a body that is vulnerable in any way, a female body, if you're a person of color, if you're disabled, if you're Indigenous, you were told that you can walk in certain ways, at certain times, in certain places. So get out there and walk, but do it a certain way, right? So again, so this is about a kind of evolution, personal evolution of walking, and an examination of that kind of politics. I'm making it sound very weighty, and it isn't all weighty. So this is going to be a piece from an essay called Night Walk with Sandra. And it's about, won't read the whole thing, but I will tell you that the very first sentence is, I walked away from my boyfriend mid-date one night in Winnipeg, and my friend Sandra came with me. So to abbreviate it, I will say that we were at the Bridge Drive-In. My boyfriend, who I'm calling Pete in this, Pete, and I had a bit of a tiff, and I had enough. And you know, it's hard to say, was I a early feminist killjoy? Or was I just a young woman with a temper and, you know, a little column A, a little column B, right? But suffice to say, I'm 17 when this takes place. And I get out of the car, I start walking away. Sandra comes with me, and we walk away from the car. There's something good about walking through a dark night with your friend, even if you don't know which of you might be Dante and which Virgil. Even if you're too young to know the difference, and even if the inferno that you passed through is familiar. Sandra and I often hung out in a group of friends. And as we walked, we talked, as we usually didn't get a chance to. Of course, our very first subject was how annoying Pete was, and since we easily agreed on that, we turned to other topics. School and friends, and the play we were in, the student newspaper, movies, and our teachers. Sandra was loopy over a guy from another school who seemed to be in love with himself in the matter of cartoon strongmen who kiss their own biceps. So we talked about that. We strolled the length of the park's 3-kilometer curve in no special rush. Pete did not follow us, and if he did, we didn't see him. When we reached the easternmost part of the curve, the sun was lower in the sky, and while it was still warm, I noted that we were about 8 kilometers away from home. I planned our route back with the authority of someone who had driven that distance countless times, and truth be told, I was eager to tackle that distance on foot. I had completed a 30-kilometer walkathon by myself the year before, so I thought those 8 kilometers through the velvety prairie night on streets I knew really well were not dangerous and would be only the smallest kind of adventure, with its sense of stolen time and independence, away for once from the patriarchal rehearsals of teenage boys and traveling under our own power. As I grew older, I would have much bigger and worse arguments with lovers, tears and snot and recriminations in public places. During these arguments, I would step out of cars and take the bus, the subway, or a cab home. I would step out of cars and be coaxed back in for decidedly chilly rides home. I wouldn't own a car myself until I was 30. And when I did, it changed everything. But on this long summer evening, I was elated by the simplicity of just walking away. The green of the park rolled away from my feet towards the trees and the river. People were running, walking, playing soccer and frisbee. And with my friend by my side, the one who came with me without question, I felt light as air. The grit that Sandra provided by being in the car and then out of the car with me was important. I felt that for once I had backup, and my act of exiting the car would have a reliable witness, and if she chose to come with me, a companion. That act of leaving the car might have been a long time coming, but it was accomplished in only a few seconds. I didn't have a real plan after that, but I meant what I said. I was fully capable of walking home. I didn't realize at the time that I wasn't giving Sandra much of a choice, but she could either come with me or sit in the car with Pete. Dobson's choice, it's called, when there's really only one thing on offer. Sandra got married a few years later, not to the boy who was in love with himself, but to a very nice guy. And still I cried at the wedding, not only because it was beautiful or because I was happy for her, but because I saw her freedom slipping away into a house in the suburbs. It filled me with a horrible grief. She didn't feel that way at all. She was giggling as she tossed her bouquet straight at me. I backed away like it was full of snakes. And a crowd of young women leapt into its path and fought for it. Proof that friends don't always want the same thing. But on the night of the walk, we were two young women out at night in the time before cell phones. We might have been carrying as much as $10 between us. It didn't occur either of us to call a cab, even when we passed a phone booth. Cabs were part of the adult world, and I'm not sure I'd even taken one at that point in my life. Certainly not by myself or with another kid. Neither of us wanted to call our parents. We wanted to solve this ourselves. We walked because we'd grown up walking to and from school. We were pragmatic girls from working class families, and we agreed that the inconvenience of the walk was well worth the freedom and the statement it would make. We were naive, of course, but this time anyway, we got away with it. We got away with daring to walk, with daring to make our own choices, with daring to pass through space. Jubilee Avenue, where the Bridge Drive-In still stands, is named for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. But as we headed west towards home, the names of places became more inflected with Indigenous culture and people. The biggest road we crossed was Pembina Highway, named for Fort Pembina, the Northwest Company's trading post in North Dakota. The highway was developed from an ox cart trail that followed the Red River south towards the fort, which is now a town that advertises itself as, quote, the oldest settlement in the Dakota Territories. The word Pembina comes from a Ojibwe word for the high bush cranberry, which Indigenous peoples and my settler mother used every year in jams and jellies. Sandra and I would cross Grant Avenue too, named for the Métis leader, Cuthbert James Grant, and just as Pembina Highway remembers a route, Grant Avenue goes all the way out of the city to the west to lead to Grant's community of St. Francis Xavier. But because we were white girls who'd been raised in colonialism, we didn't know this, or much of it, yet. I go on a little while, and then I return to Sandra's wedding. At the wedding, Sandra hugged me in her lace gown and her veil puffed up against my face in a cloud. I hugged her back as hard as I could, and then she was off on her rounds, embracing each guest in turn. I wondered how soon I could make my exit, but I tricked myself into joining conversations and stayed late enough to see her leave the reception for her honeymoon. She was wearing what used to be called a going away outfit. Hers was a sky blue skirt suit that matched her new husband's tie. I kissed her and I wished her luck. She was my friend and I meant it. Sandra and I had threaded our way through the city at night, and I think of our route as though it's marked on a map, with the phosphorus of our bones trailing behind us, glowing just slightly after all these years. What if the molecules in the walking feet and the swinging arms of young feminists were bioluminescent? If the energy we released took the form of light? What if every time a young woman walked away from someone who wanted to make her small, the trail glowed and stayed that way, neither perilous nor impossible? And we end up walking past the Grand Park Mall, that side, and along Grand Avenue. So tune into that essay for more of our route, which, if you know Winnipeg well, you can map it. Okay, so I'm going to read one more short thing, and this is called Bird Watching for Beginners, an incomplete quiz. And you'll note that when Ariel introduced me, she said that I identify as a bad birder. And I do. Birding is very competitive pastime. Yes, I hope you're laughing because you know this is true. And if you know someone who's a really serious birder, you know, God forbid you misidentify a sparrow because, man, the wrath of the birder comes down on you. I am considered a rogue birder on several birding sites where I've posted that I've seen something that couldn't possibly be seen in that region and time. But quite frankly, I'm proud to be a bad birder because I think if we wait until we're experts in everything, we're never going to observe anything at all. So, and I also know that some people say, oh, I would love to do that because I'm fascinated with birds, but I just don't know anything. Don't want to be mocked. So anyway, this is a little piece called Bird Watching for Beginners, an incomplete quiz. Question 1. If 2 egrets appear in a pond by a highway in northern Ontario in June, and the observer is in the passenger seat of a car driving at 120 kilometers an hour, how quickly will expert birders tell her that she couldn't have seen the egrets? A, within 20 minutes of posting on Facebook. B, within 2 minutes on iNaturalist. C, fix or it didn't happen. D, how is this even a question? 2, the best way to distinguish between a soaring hawk and an ambitious crow is A, flight pattern, B, plumage, C, size, D, bird poems are so 1988. 3, when you spot 2 rabbits in the morning, do you interpret this as a sign for A, warm weather, B, fecundity, C, clear and present danger, D, the inability of the quiz compiler to focus on birds? 4, when your elderly neighbor welcomes you to the neighborhood and says, be careful of the, and then can't remember the name of the animal he means to describe, do you, A, assume he means a raccoon, B, prepare for the animal apocalypse, C, become immediately distracted by a loathsome fantasy in which you lift the garbage can lid to find a hissing and possibly fainting possum? Or D, become immediately distracted by a lovely fantasy in which you lift the garbage can lid to find a hissing and possibly fainting possum? 5, your photographer friend sees a heron standing in a pond and wants a photo of the bird with its wings spread. He asks you to toss a stick to startle the heron. Do you choose a stick carefully and aim to miss? B, tell him to toss his own damn stick. C, throw a stick at the photographer to see if he startles. D, slowly raise one leg and stretch your neck forward. 6, when you see a falcon's nest atop a light standard viewable from your mother's hospital room, do you A, get her into a wheelchair and take her to the window to look? B, believe her when she says she can see the nest from the bed? C, sit in the hospital's miracle garden on the 10th of the 16 days for dying and listen to the young falcons peeping in their high voices? D, why are you even thinking of birds? You are the worst. 7, when you spot a 3-legged dog at any time during your day, do you A, interpret it as a sign that you'll see 2 rabbits the next morning? B, reject the sight as inspo porn? C, pursue it for a selfie? Or D, remember a joke about a 3-legged dog named Tripod and wonder if that was the whole joke or if there's more to it? 8, when you say that you are writing poems about how disconnected you feel from the natural world and how there were years so bad you thought you would die and the only thing that saved you each day was a walk by the creek, and the other writer you're talking to snorts and says, that's a cliche, do you A, say nothing, B, say, saying that's a cliche is a cliche, C, listen to a tinny version of your own voice yelling, your own voice in your head yelling, walk away, D, walk away. 9, and the final question, when next you see a bird, do you think A, there's a bird, B, there's a poem, C, there, D. Thank you.
The other great thing about Noelle at Wolfsack and Wind is she doesn't mind when her creative nonfiction people stuff poems into their manuscripts. And I know that Jenna Butler did it I know that I did it. And so it's so lovely to read this hybrid work and that, you know, is that your first poem that you ever published?
Not quite.
Oh, see, I was hoping for another debut. Anyways, I'd like to thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to thank you guys so much for those readings. It was great to be read to. I think that's the thing. I think you can create community online. I think Zoom events have a lot of advantages around, you know, accessibility and access and all those things. But there's nothing that beats coming together in person and being people together. Anyways, thank you so much to John. He's going to give you the final instructions, and it's the end of things. So thank you.
And thank you, Erin. So yes, we will be moving along to the signing portion of the evenings. We'll transport our authors over to the table, at which point you should feel free to approach them to have books signed and then pay for them. Thank you all so very much for your readings tonight. It was so wonderful to hear from all of you, to welcome some folks back and some people here for the first time behind a microphone. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you everybody who's watching live on YouTube as well. The video will remain live, so if you'd like to revisit it or share it with anyone, please feel free to do so. The one thing I will point out is that you may notice that the store is actually closed. This is not for those folks attending this event, although we do ask that you please just remain roughly centralized around the signing table rather than fleeing off into various corners, simply because we don't have the staff to help you. But please do feel free to go up to the table and get your book signed there. Thank you all so very much once again. Thank you to all the publishers who helped bring these books into the world. And please, oh, and I guess as well, thank you very much to Ariel Gordon for not only organizing this event, but for hosting. A genuine note of gratitude to close us out. Thank you all so very much.